Or is that part of their conversation at all, or any communication between the two of them?
Yes, it is. It's it's always supposed to be. And that communication can come from like a remark on the release, or it can come from several different things. A phone call, um, a like something that he writes on there. In this case, do you remember how he did it? How he communicated that, or did you see that part of it?
I just I noticed he typed in an additional 2,000 pounds of fuel on it before he released the aircraft. I don't know if there were any comments. I can't go back and tell you because I was still observing with my mouth agape, so to speak.
Yeah, I hear you. Let's see. 1 second here. I'm just getting back into this. Sorry about this, guys. I didn't expect that thing to decide to turn off and on like that. Okay. I think we should be back where we were here. Everybody still hear me okay? I'm back now onto my original one here. Hopefully don't have that problem again.
All's well.
Okay. All right. So the communication. So either a phone call, or he can put a remark on the release saying, added extra fuel for de-ice delays, or whatever. Right there. That's what he should do. Anytime you add extra fuel for any reason, you usually want to say why. Because the pilot will be able to see, hey, we've got a bunch of extra fuel. And they're going to want to know why. So either a phone call or anything else, if you put the remark on the release, um, they'll always look there, to see it. So it could just be something quick, unless it requires a lengthier explanation to where they need to call you, or you can even put it right there. Please call me when you get the release, and then you can go over stuff as well.
I think now that you mention it, I think he did type in some remarks after doing that.
Okay. Good deal. Well, let's move along here. We're going to talk a lot more about that subject as well as we move on, but no, that's a big one there, though. So just remember, it's your responsibility to keep all the safety information up to date. Let's see here. This next one we're going to talk about is 121.607, Communication and Navigation Facilities for Domestic and Flag Operations. Except as provided in paragraph B of this section, for a certificate holder conducting flag operations, no person may dispatch an airplane over an approved route or route segment unless the communication and navigation facilities required by 121.99 and 121.103 for the approval of that route or segment are in satisfactory operating condition. What that means to us is just that if you're planning a flight, you, as the dispatcher, have the responsibility to make sure that whatever type of navigation system you're planning to use, whether that be ground navigation or satellite navigation, you need to make sure that it's going to reliably work throughout the entire flight. Okay, you're not allowed to dispatch into an area that has navigation facilities that you are planning to use that are out of service or not functioning. So it's your responsibility to verify that it is functioning and it is working, and that you can rely on it when you send your flight that direction. pretty straightforward. The next part says, if because of technical reasons or other reasons beyond the control of a certificate holder conducting flag operations, the facilities required by 121.99, 121.103 are not available over a route or route segment outside the United States, the certificate holder may dispatch an airplane over that route or route segment if the pilot in command and dispatcher find that communication and navigation facilities equal to those required are available and in satisfactory operating conditions. So it's basically saying if whatever you were planning on using becomes not available, as long as there's something else in there you can rely on or within range of your navigation capabilities to be able to use to navigate through that area, then you can still go through there. There are a lot of remote areas of the world where there's only certain type of navigation facilities available where they have to be functioning in order to send a flight through there. You don't really deal with that too much at a regional, like in a SkyWest flight environment. But, like I'm at UPS now dealing with their flights, they send stuff right over the North Pole, right over the top. And there's only, you have to do very, very special type of navigation planning in order to authorize a flight to go over the North Pole. And there's very specific sets of rules for that type of an operation as well. In fact, there's a whole section in the FARs that's just called polar operations. We're not going to learn about it in this class, but as you progress through your dispatch careers and as you have opportunities to do new types of dispatching or go on to other airlines that maybe do that kind of thing, you'll learn a lot about it and what's required. But lots of different planes. Like if you're flying over ocean, like even if you're flying from California to Hawaii, everything in between that's going to be, until you get to Hawaii is going to be ocean. So there are certain things that you have to do in order to authorize an aircraft to be able to fly that route where there's nothing but water from the point you take off is all water until the point that you land. So you have to have special plans in place and special navigation capabilities, and a lot of things have to kind of align in order to authorize a plane to be able to fly a route like that. And you can understand why, right? I mean, you're talking about a 2-engine aircraft. You get an engine failure halfway to Hawaii, what are you going to do? Are you going to, you got to choose essentially. And when you talk about that type of flying, there's different types of alternates that have to be listed. They're called equal time point alternates, where if you're 50% of the way to Hawaii, there's basically a point along that route where if an engine fails before this point, I'm turning around and I'm going back to California. If it happens after this point, I'm continuing on to Hawaii, because there is nothing in between there where you're going to be able to land. And you still might be 3 hours away from, like I said, if it happens right smack in the middle, you might be 3 hours back or 3 hours forward, but regardless, you're 3 hours from landing with one engine. So, and you got to be able to fly the rest of that flight with one engine, right? And that's why we plan, going back to what I was talking about a few minutes ago, where we plan everything with one engine capabilities only. That's why. Because although it's not normal to have an engine fail, just strictly by quantity and the number of flights that are dispatched throughout the world, it's just simply a numbers game. You still will have several of them. Here's a perfect example for SkyWest. When I left SkyWest, I was a shift manager. Basically means that my job on a daily basis when I worked was I oversaw the entire OCC, dispatchers, system controllers, and so I dealt with everything from if there was ever any type of emergency or anything like that, I always was in the loop as to what was going on or handling it directly. So SkyWest, while I was kind of working in that function, had anywhere between 2,000 and 22 or 2,300 flights a day. And So you take that's just on a daily basis. And so just to kind of give you an idea of how often I would see an engine failure based on a SkyWest engine failure, right? So I would see an engine failure probably 2 or 3 times a month based on 2,000, 2,300 flights a day. So in that aspect, you've seen it 2 or 3 times a month, over the space of working there for 5 or 6 years. That's a decent amount of exposure to engine fail procedures, right? And that's on a SkyWest flight where you're not flying over water, you're not flying to Hawaii, but just as an example, I mean, we still have to plan everything to always be conducted over safely with one engine. So if I'm seeing 2 or 3 engine failures a month just at SkyWest alone, and those are for various reasons. I mean, we didn't ever have an uncontained engine failure like you saw with Southwest the other day, but the bottom line is it's still an engine failure, which means when you lose an engine, you're going to drift down in altitude. And so if the flights had not been planned the way you were supposed to do it properly based on one engine fail procedures always on every flight, then I guarantee you that several of those, and I probably saw 50 or 60 of them during my time at SkyWest. I can guarantee you that several of those 50 or 60 would have been total loss, total casualty accidents, worst possible scenario, had they not been planned with the one engine failsafe procedures that we use. Okay, and that's a guide, that's a regulation, that's something we have to do as a 121 airline. That's any 121 airline has to do it that way. But you get into the other, the I don't call them lesser, but like the other types of flying out there, Part 135, and most of those have the same types of rules. But a lot of airplanes only have one engine. So what happens in those cases? Well, the plane's obviously going to go down. It turns into a glider. So there's different procedures for everything, but that just kind of just to put things in perspective about the safety that is required to fly in the 121 passenger movement world for an airline. That there's a lot of protocols, and it's becoming safer and safer and safer to go 6 or 7 years with one fatality. That's pretty safe considering the amount of flights and the millions of people that are being moved. So, yeah, I mean, but not to get too off topic there, but yeah, you always have to make sure that wherever you're dispatching your airplanes, that all of the navigational facilities that you plan to use are operational and functioning and will be available during your flight. If they're not, then you need to make alternate plans. So let's move on from that one. Just remember, if you guys are paying attention to these, and when you go back and study these, pay attention to these ones that are boxed in red. Those are the ones that we really want you to know as dispatchers. The ones that are highlighted, that are not boxed in red, are ones that we want you to read through. They're not necessarily ones you need to go memorize, but they're ones that we want you to be familiar with. We highlight them to draw them to your attention. But for us and the rest of this class, we're just going to go over the ones that are in red because there's just simply too much information to go over everything. So this next one is 121.613, dispatch or flight release under IFR over or IFR or over the top. This one says, except as provided in 121.615, no person may dispatch or release an aircraft for operations under IFR or over the top unless appropriate weather reports or forecasts or any combination thereof indicate that the weather conditions will be at or above the authorized minimums at the estimated time of arrival at the airport or airports to which dispatched or released. Okay, so this FAR is an extremely important FAR. This is one that you absolutely have to know and have to understand what it's telling us. If you're writing this down in note taking, we refer to this FAR as what is called legal to go. Okay, and you are going to hear this phrase legal to go hundreds of times over the next 8 weeks or 7 weeks at this point. Okay, legal to go is the very, very, very first step you take as a dispatcher on every single flight that you will ever dispatch. It is step one. It is one of the most important things. And what this is telling us is to put it into normal person terms here instead of federal regulation read here, just to kind of dissect this a little bit. It's telling us that you cannot dispatch a flight unless the weather reports or forecasts or any combination of those things tell us that the weather at our destination, okay, at the estimated time that we are supposed to arrive at the destination, will be at or above the authorized minimums. Okay, so when this says authorized minimums, what that means to us is that every airport that we dispatch to as dispatchers has weather minimum criteria. Okay, and it depends on the type of airport and where it's located and the terrain surrounding it. Sometimes those authorized minimums are higher, sometimes they're lower. A lot of it depends on the size of the airport. And we're going to talk a lot about those weather minimums as this class progresses. But just to kind of give you an idea, let's say we'll just use our Salt Lake to St. George example since it's at home for most of us. If I'm sending a flight from Salt Lake to St. George and the weather in St. George is a little dicey, and I'm looking at the forecast, let's say I can go into my charts and I can look up the St. George weather minimum criteria, right? And as long as all of the facilities and the instrumentation in St. George is functioning, I can look up what my weather minimums are for St. George. And if I get in there and I look it up and it tells me that the weather that I need in St. George needs to be at least a half of a mile visibility and 300-foot ceiling or better. Okay, a ceiling, in case you haven't covered it yet, is basically just a layer of clouds. It's like, when you see a low cloud ceiling that's, only a couple hundred feet off the ground, or if a cloud ceiling is on the ground, then we have fog, right? So that's where we get fog. But if I'm looking at St. George and it's telling me, okay, I need a 300-foot ceiling and a half a mile of visibility in order to land at that airport. Okay, so I write those numbers down: 300-foot ceiling, half mile visibility. Okay, I take those numbers, I look at the forecast for St. George, and then that forecast, and I know you guys have looked at weather a little bit, and you're going to look at it a lot as we continue on. But I look at the forecast, or what we call the TAF for St. George, and I look at the estimated time of arrival. I know that I'm going from Salt Lake to St. George. That flight is roughly an hour, and I'm leaving in an hour from now. And so I know that when I look at the forecast, I need to look 2 hours down the road, and I can look at St. George. Okay, at that point, at that estimated time of arrival, is the forecast in St. George at least a half a mile visibility and a 300-foot ceiling? If it is not, if it is anything lower than those minimums, then my flight is not legal to go. Okay? If it is better than those minimums, then my flight is legal to go. Okay? So it's a black or a white thing. There's no gray area with this regulation. Black and white. You either have the minimums or you do not have the minimums in the forecast. If you do not have them, you are not legal. If you do have them, you are legal. Does this making sense to everybody?
Yeah.
Yeah?
What makes sense to me. I don't want to speak for everybody else.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
You can speak for me.
If anybody, yeah, if it's not making sense, then speak up. So silence is a good sign here. If we'll take the
So
sign.
each airport has its own minimums, correct?
Correct, yes. And so it's your responsibility as a dispatcher to figure out what those minimums are for every flight that you're conducting. Okay. Now, it's not like you got to go look it up every time. Like if you know that the weather is great in St. George for the whole day, and it's not, you're only talking about scenarios where the weather's maybe going to be bad, right? But if you look at the forecast and it says, 10 miles, clear skies all day long, then yeah, you're not worrying about this, right? You're going to be legal to go. It's just in the case that, I've got a dust storm or something blowing in, and, that half-mile visibility might not have it, because there's a thunderstorm and it's kicking up dust and, whatever other thing that might affect that. So, but yeah, you got to look into these things. That's stuff you'd be looking at anyway as a dispatcher on every flight. You're responsible to look at the weather for your origin, your takeoff, your alternates. Now, you're going to learn a lot of rules, but this is the number one rule. Okay, this is the first number one rule that you got to know as a dispatcher. This is legal to go. So if you're ever asked to explain, if they come up to you and say, explain to me what is legal to go, okay? It's the very first thing you do on any flight. You get a flight assigned to you, the first thing you're looking at, okay, what's my ETA? Boom. Where's my forecast? Boom. What's my weather? Okay. And then make sure that it's better than what the minimums are for that airport. And you're going to learn how to do all this stuff. You're going to do it so many times in this class that this is not going to be any issue at all for anybody. But, this is maybe the first time you're hearing about it. So this is,
Adam, I have a question.
yeah.
We talk about visibility and thunderstorms and all that. Is there like a wind requirement? Like St. George, we get a lot of like high wind and stuff.
Uh-huh.
Do they have that kind of a thing, or does that matter?
Yes. Yeah, it does matter. And it's something we'll talk a lot about, but just as a quick, just kind of to sum it up a little bit, like St. George has one runway. Well, technically two, but it's one strip of concrete, right? Runway 19 on the one end, and then on the opposite end is runway number 1, depending on which direction you're flying, right? You might land on runway 1, you might land on runway 19. So if the weather minimums to land on runway 19 will be different than the weather minimums to land on runway 1, okay, the opposite end. And that's just simply based on the instrumentation for the landing system, the capabilities of what we can use from the airplane perspective to navigate into that runway, So so those minimums will be different depending on which runway you're landing on, and you have to pick which runway you're landing on based on the wind. Okay, so yeah, the wind is a factor. Now let's say the runway 19 is our best minimums, and that's that 300-foot ceiling, half-mile visibility that we talked about earlier. Let's say runway 1 requires 1,000-foot ceiling and 3 miles visibility. Okay, but let's say the wind is favoring. Now, when you land an airplane, you want to land into the wind. Just like when you take off into the wind. So there are certain thresholds that you can use. Like if the wind is favoring to land on runway 1, depending on how bad the wind is, you can still land an airplane with a tailwind as long as the tailwind doesn't exceed 10 knots, 10 nautical miles per hour. Or there's also crosswind limitations. You can go up to like a 25 or 30 knot crosswind. So you can still try to land on the runway that is best on the weather. Like, let's say that the weather is good enough to land on 19, but not good enough to land on runway 1, and that the wind favors runway 1. Well, you can still land on 19 up to a 10 knot tailwind or up to a 25 or 30 knot crosswind and still land on runway 19. But if it exceeds those limitations, the tailwind or the crosswind, then you're going to be limited to just runway 1 and whatever those minimums are. So yes, it does play a role, and I don't really want to introduce too much of that right now, but you'll see it a lot. You'll see it a lot when we get into flight planning and your runway selection process. So, but yeah, that's a good question though. Any other questions on legal to go before I move along?
Quickly, over the top is talking about above the clouds.
Correct. Yeah. So when we talk about IFR, that's instrument flight rules. Okay. So in order to fly instrument flight rules, that's basically meaning that so there's VFR and there's IFR, visual flight rules and instrument flight rules. Visual flight rules simply mean that you are able to maintain visual separation from the ground, terrain, and other aircraft at all times. Okay, and that's just by you seeing with your own two eyes. Okay, and you're responsible for separation yourself. ATC is not responsible for separating you. They're usually in VFR. Sometimes you're not even talking to ATC at all. If you file IFR, that means that you are a qualified pilot that can fly using only your instruments without visibly being able to see the ground, see the surrounding terrain, and see other aircraft. Okay? In an IFR environment, air traffic control is always responsible for separating you from other aircraft. And you, based on following your instruments in your plane, are responsible for separating yourself from the ground and terrain around you. Okay, so that's IFR and VFR. Now, when you talk about over the top just means that you're in visual conditions, but yeah, you're flying over the top of the clouds. You still can see, but you can't see the ground. That's the only difference with over the top. It just means that you're in visual conditions in every way, shape, and form, other than the fact that you cannot see the ground because you're flying above the clouds. But that's all over the top means. So you can file VFR over the top or IFR over the top. You can file either of those types of plans, but normally you're not going to hear too much about the term over the top in the 121 world because every flight that we dispatch is IFR.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? Okay. Let's skip down to 121.617. This is alternate airport for departure. Okay. Just upon reading that term, alternate airport for departure, it's already kind of confusing. So a lot of people think, okay, I'm taking off from Salt Lake City. What in the world would alternate airport for departure mean? Right? Anybody want to take a stab at what this might mean? Silence is beautiful.
For oh my goodness, lost the word. Irregular ops where you have to land at another station for mechanical issues or to refuel.
Yeah, potentially. But we're talking about alternate airport for departure though. So this is for takeoff. Okay, this is called.
So would that involve weather conditions? You've got sufficient visibility, let's say RVR for takeoff, cloud cover, all conditions are okay for takeoff, but you have higher minimums for landing, so you could not return to that airport because of weather, current weather.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Now, along that same lines though, so what would be a reason if you just took off, right? Remember, we're talking about takeoff alternate here. If you just took off, why would you potentially need to return to the airport that you just took off from?
Mechanical. Passenger emergency.
Exactly. Yep. That's almost always what it is. Okay? That is the only reason. The only reason, well, let's just blanket this by saying emergency. Okay? Takeoff alternate. The only reason you're returning to the origin is an emergency. Okay? Mechanical, medical, whatever. Emergency. That's the only reason. Otherwise, why would you, right? Why would you need to return to the airport you just left? Okay, so if that happens, right, you're going to see a common theme throughout the course, and as you learn about weather, we can take off in weather that's a lot lower or worse weather than we can land in. Okay, so the weather minimums for takeoff is always going to be a lot lower than it is for landing. So, like Jeff was saying, a lot of times the weather, if it's in between that threshold, it's good enough for takeoff, but it's not good enough to land. If you were to take off and have an emergency and needed to return, you couldn't return to your origin because it's not good enough to land in the weather, that is. In that scenario, you as a dispatcher need to list an alternate airport for departure, or we're going to call it, from this point forward, we will call it a takeoff alternate. But if the weather at your origin airport is below landing minimums for that airport, then you have to list a takeoff alternate. Okay? And all that's telling the crew is that if you take off and have an emergency, you can't come back to where you just took off from. You're going to need to go to this airport that you're going to specify on the dispatch release as the takeoff alternate. Now, there are other parameters for a takeoff alternate. Okay, so we're going to read this real quick. If the weather conditions at the airport of takeoff are below the landing minimums in the certificate holder's operation specifications for that airport, when this says certificate holder, that just means airline, okay? In the airline operation specifications for that airport, no person may dispatch or release an aircraft from that airport unless the dispatch or flight release specifies an alternate airport located within the following distances from the airport of takeoff. Okay, for an aircraft that has 2 engines, not more than 1 hour from the departure airport at normal cruising speed in still air with 1 engine inoperative. Okay? So let's dissect that just a little bit more here. Okay? So if you need to list a takeoff alternate, that takeoff alternate cannot be more than 1 hour from your origin airport. And that 1 hour is based on normal cruising speed in still air with 1 engine inoperative. So why do you think that at the end of that, why are they throwing in that 1 engine inoperative statement at the end of this?
Everything is based upon 1 engine inoperative.
Correct. Yeah. Everything we plan is based on 1 engine inop. Okay? So just, it goes back to, you're going to see that a lot with everything we do. So,
Adam.
Yeah.
I had a question. That still air, it looks like a gotcha to me. What does still air mean? Like en route, at your arrival, your alternate, your takeoff alternate, still air, that looks like a gotcha to me.
Still air just simply means you don't need to factor the wind. Okay, so if you're saying that basically means that if you need to plan a takeoff alternate for one of your flights, that you don't need to go and take a look at the wind and figure all that stuff out in order to plan it, because it would take you 2 hours just to figure out your takeoff alternate if you got to go and calculate wind and everything else to figure out, okay, well, this this flight is 1 hour because, I have a huge tailwind, so I'm going to get there faster than I would tomorrow, or the day before where it had a big headwind. So it's just basically saying you can look at it just from a distance standpoint and not have to worry about the wind, and then one engine inoperative, basically. So just as an example, the aircraft that we use in this class that you're going to get introduced to and use all for your flight planning in this class is the CRJ 700. That aircraft, based on what SkyWest has come up with from their own calculation of this FAR, a CRJ 700, a takeoff alternate, if you're in a CRJ 700, a takeoff alternate cannot be more than 300 nautical miles from your origin airport. That's basically what SkyWest says. That complies with that 1 hour at normal cruising speed in still air with one engine inoperative rule. Okay, 300 nautical miles. So if you need to plan, if you're working at SkyWest and you're dispatching a CRJ 700 and you need a takeoff alternate, the only thing that you really care about is 300 nautical miles or less. And you know that if you do that, you're complying with everything else on there. Does that make sense? But also, one of the common reasons that an aircraft would need to go to a dispatch alternate would be engine failure. Okay, so it makes sense that it says one engine inoperative because that's a common cause of a mechanical emergency, is having an engine failure.
This happened in Flagstaff once. Phoenix had reached peak temperature, and so they couldn't return to Phoenix. They had to come to Flagstaff.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can totally see where that can make. I've seen that happen. Where we get over max temperature a lot. So if you look at that next paragraph, it's not in the red. The only one that I want you guys to memorize is just what you see in the red there. Just remember, because you're going to get a quiz question, and that quiz question will say, what is the definition, or why would I need a takeoff alternate? And you need to be able to say, well, if the weather at the origin is below landing minimums, then you must list a takeoff alternate. And then you're going to get another question that says, in selecting a takeoff alternate, what do you need to abide by? And you need to be able to say, it cannot be more than 1 hour from the departure airport at normal cruising speed in still air with one engine in op. Okay, that you need to have that memorized. The next paragraph, though, if you talking about aircraft having 3 or more engines, okay, the rule goes up a little bit. It actually allows you to have 2 hours instead of 1 hour. Okay, but obviously for good reasons, right? If you got an aircraft that has 3 or more engines and you only have one engine in op, you still got 2 engines working. So they give you an extra hour because you got an extra engine. Okay. If there's no questions on takeoff alternates, then let's move on for alternate airport for the destination, which is 121.619. Now, this one you've probably already talked about a little bit. This is the 1, 2, 3 rule. Have you talked about that yet?
No.
Okay. So you will refer to this FAR is what we call the 1, 2, 3 rule. And similar to the legal to go rule that we just talked about, the 1, 2, 3 rule is going to be the next biggest thing, second only to legal to go, that you need to know as a dispatcher. You're going to use that step 1, that legal to go, you're going to use that on every flight you ever dispatch. This next one, this 1, 2, 3 rule, you're also going to use this on every single flight. There's very few things that you will learn in this class that you will literally put into practice on every flight you dispatch. And legal to go and the 1, 2, 3 rule are two of those things that you use on every single flight, no matter what the flight is, no matter what the weather is, no matter what any other parameter of your flight is, you will always use legal to go and the 1, 2, 3 rule on every flight. Okay, so let's talk about this one. No person may dispatch an airplane under IFR or over the top unless he lists at least one alternate for each destination airport in the dispatch release. Okay, so that first little sentence there is telling us that no person can dispatch an airplane unless he lists at least one alternate for each destination, okay? So that's just a blanket statement. Every destination requires an alternate, okay? Let's continue on here. When the weather conditions forecast for the destination and first alternate airport are marginal, at least one additional alternate must be designated. Okay, and so we're going to circle back and talk about this in just a minute. It says, however, no alternate airport is required if for at least 1 hour before and 1 hour after the estimated time of arrival at the destination airport, the appropriate weather reports or forecasts, or any combination of them, indicate that number one, the ceiling will be at least 2,000 feet above the airport elevation, and two, visibility will be at least 3 miles. Okay, so starting from the top here, every flight you dispatch needs a destination alternate. That's what the first sentence says. Okay. The second sentence says when the weather conditions for the destination and the first alternate airport are marginal, and we'll go on to talk about what marginal means later, but when the weather is going to be marginal at the destination and at your alternate, then you need to list a second alternate, okay? So we're gonna pretend that that sentence doesn't exist for right now, because the only thing that we really want to focus on right now is the first sentence and the last sentence, okay? So just taking the first sentence alone, it says that every destination needs an alternate, okay? Now let's skip to the last sentence. It says, however, no alternate airport is required if for at least 1 hour before and 1 hour after the estimated time of arrival at the destination airport, the appropriate weather reports or forecasts, or the combination of them, indicate that the ceiling will be at least 2,000 feet above the airport and visibility will be at least 3 miles. Okay, so it's telling us that every destination needs an alternate, but then it's saying unless the weather is, it gives us this little window here, okay? It says 1 hour before to 1 hour after. So one of the very first things you look at on your flight is you look at your ETA, right? That's like when you start a flight, regardless of what the cities are, the origin, the destination, we'll just stay with our Salt Lake St. George example, Salt Lake City to St. George. When you look at that, the very first thing, outside of seeing what the two cities are and where you're flying, the next thing you usually look at is your ETA, okay? Because going back to that legal to go rule, in order to figure out your legal to go parameters, you need to know what the ETA is, okay? Because you got to look at that ETA, and then you got to look at your weather, and then you got to make sure you have your landing minimums in the forecast or better in order to be legal to go. And then the next step is you do this 1, 2, 3 rule, okay? You know what your ETA is. Let's say my ETA is 4 p.m. I'm supposed to arrive in St. George at 4 p.m. I've already done my legal to go calculation. I looked at the St. George forecast, and at 4 p.m. the weather was good. I've got my weather is above those landing minimum parameters, okay? So I know that my flight is legal to go, okay? So that step is done, okay? Now, one thing that you got to remember, and if you can put like in big, bold letters, if you're taking notes here, and you've got these notes on legal to go, and now you're writing notes on the 1, 2, 3 rule, if you've got some space in between there, you've got to learn, because the one common thing that you're going to do over the rest of this next 7 weeks is that you will often confuse these two rules, okay? Legal to go and the 1, 2, 3 rule. Your head is going to want to interchange these rules in every way, shape, or form possible. Okay, so whatever you do from here going forward, whatever's best for you as far as a memorization and learning standpoint, you've got to remember and somehow keep these two rules completely separate from themselves. They are independent, 100% independent of each other. Okay, although you look at a lot of the same things, they are giving you two totally different outcomes, okay? So let's talk about that legal to go for just 1 second here. When you're figuring out the legal to go rule, the only thing you care about is your ETA, okay? The exact time, not an hour before, not an hour after. The only time you care about is the exact time you're supposed to arrive. And at that exact time, your weather at your destination needs to be above your landing minimums. Okay, it's pretty cut and dry. If it is, you can go. If it's not, you cannot go. Okay, that's legal to go. Once you get to that step, once you figure out legal to go and whether you can or cannot go, you're done. You got to turn that rule off, you move on, and then you go into this rule. This rule, being totally separate and totally different from that rule, you still need to know what your ETA is, okay? So you know what your ETA is because you just used it to figure out legal to go. Now you're going to use it to figure out this rule. This is your 1, 2, 3 rule, and this is determining whether or not you need to list an alternate for your destination. Now also don't confuse this with takeoff alternates, okay, that we talked about in between legal to go and 1, 2, 3 rule. This is not takeoff alternate. This is alternate for the destination. So you need to know your ETA. The only difference here is that you care about more than just your ETA. Okay? With legal to go, we only cared about the exact time of our arrival. With the 1, 2, 3 rule, there's a 2-hour window, 1 hour before our ETA up to 1 hour after our ETA. So if our ETA is 4 p.m., then I'm going to care about the window from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. with my ETA being smack dab in the middle of that, right? 1 hour before, 1 hour after. In that window from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m., you're still looking at the St. George forecast. And you're specifically looking for anything in there that tells you that the cloud ceiling will be at least 2,000 feet above the airport and at least 3 miles visibility. So that entire 2-hour window, 1 hour before your ETA all the way to 1 hour after your ETA, that entire window, 2-hour window, has to be everything in there. Everything, every ceiling and every visibility has to be at least a 2,000 foot or better ceiling and at least 3 miles or better visibility. Okay? Now, where people get this confused, okay, just to tell you some of the common things that people like to interchange with this and the legal to go rule is that people will take that 2-hour window and they'll use it on the legal to go, okay? Or people will take the landing minimums and apply it to the 1, 2, 3 rule. So now in the 1, 2, 3 rule, we don't care about the landing minimums, okay? When you did your legal to go, you went and you looked up those landing minimums for St. George. You figured out that that the bare bones landing minimums were 300-foot ceiling and a half-mile visibility, right? And that was the only thing you cared about. You needed to know if the weather at your ETA was better than 300 feet ceiling, half-mile visibility. You looked it up, you saw that it is, you're good, okay? Good to go. Now, this one, you don't care about those landing minimums. You have to get those landing minimums out of your head, because in this one, you're using a 2,000-foot ceiling and a 3-mile visibility. And the nice thing about the 1, 2, 3 rule is that it's the same for every airport, okay? So you don't need to go look up new information. It's the 1, 2, 3 rule is the rule, whether it's St. George, Vegas, Salt Lake, it doesn't matter where you're going. The 1, 2, 3 rule is the same, okay? But you take that 2-hour window now, and you want to make sure that nothing inside that window is lower than a 2,000-foot ceiling or lower than 3 miles visibility. Okay? If it is, all it means is that you need to list an alternate for the destination. Okay? You can kind of see where people will mix these up, and you're definitely going to see for yourselves how you'll mix it up, because a lot of people will think, oh, it's below a 2,000-foot ceiling and 3 miles. That means I'm not legal to go. No, it does not mean you're not legal to go. It just means you need an alternate, okay? Just an alternate. So this is simply just for figuring out the alternate. But first of all, you had to figure out whether you were legal to go. Once you got a yes on your legal to go, then you need to figure out whether you need an alternate, okay? And that's where you use the 1, 2, 3 rule. So whatever makes sense the best for you in your note taking, to write that in there and not confuse those two rules. You got to memorize both of them. Probably the two most important rules you will learn in dispatch at all. Any questions?
So 1, 2, 3 represents 1 hour before, 1 hour after. 2 is 2,000-foot ceiling. 3 is 3 miles visibility.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up. As I was going to say that, but yeah, that is where that's why it's the 1, 2, 3 rule. 1 hour before and after, it's got to be a 2,000-foot ceiling and 3 miles visibility. Yeah, that's where the 1, 2, 3 comes from. If you want to know one of the little gotchas that the FAA tries to get you with this rule is sometimes you'll get this question. Okay, you'll get a question that says, when does my flight require an alternate? When do I need a destination alternate? And the answer to that question is always. Unless you have better than a 2,000-foot ceiling and 3 miles visibility 1 hour before to 1 hour after your ETA. Okay, so it's kind of a stupid little thing, but it's looked at backwards. Okay, a destination always needs an alternate unless it can abide by the 1, 2, 3 rule. It's not the other way around, like where a destination never needs an alternate unless it's lower than 2003. So just remember that backwards, I guess, if in case you're ever asked, because they like to do that, like in the practical test, they like to say, when does a flight require an alternate? The answer to that question is always, unless you can abide by the 1, 2, 3 rule parameters. Any questions on that rule? And just on a side note, I mean, if it seems confusing or kind of too much information at this point, legal to go and 1, 2, 3 rule and the takeoff alternate and all of the stuff that you're talking about, you're going to see this a lot. You're going to see this in quizzes. You're going to see it in flight planning. You're going to see it hundreds of times before this class is completed and before you're licensed. So you're going to get plenty of practice using these rules and applying them, and and utilizing them. So don't worry too much about it if it's confusing right now. Right now it's just kind of the groundwork and the memorizing of the rule.
Adam, my notes basically say, to sum it up, you must always list an alternate airport unless you meet the 1, 2, 3 rule.
Correct.
Is that a adequate statement for notes?
It is, yep.
Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, I will move along here. This next one talks about alternate airport weather criteria. So this is talking about once you figure out that maybe you need an alternate. Now, this is not talking about just a destination alternate. This is any alternate. If it's a takeoff alternate or a destination alternate, the alternate airports have weather criteria that they have to meet. And we're not going to talk about what that criteria is today, but it is something we'll talk about later and practice doing later. But let's just read this. Basically says, no person may list an airport as an alternate in the dispatcher flight release unless the appropriate weather reports or forecasts indicate that the weather conditions will be at or above the alternate weather minimum specified in the airline's operation specs for that airport when the flight arrives. So it's basically just telling us that when you list alternate airports, whether it's a takeoff alternate, a destination alternate, or anything in between, that they have specific weather minimums for an alternate, and which you're going to learn later how to figure that out. But it's basically just telling us that you can't list it as an alternate unless the weather is better than those minimums. It's similar to the legal to go rule, except it's legal to think of it as legal to go for an alternate. Okay, same deal though. And the only thing we care about is the ETA. It's not a 2-hour window deal. It's just simply, if I'm listing an alternate, then you're going to know the ETA that you would be going to that. If you needed to divert to that alternate or use that alternate, you'll more or less know, okay, this would be my ETA if I do have to go there. And at that ETA, the weather needs to be better than the alternate weather minimums, which you'll learn about later. So legal to go for an alternate is kind of how I would call that. 121.627, continuing flight in unsafe conditions. This one is a pretty straightforward rule. It's just saying no pilot in command may allow a flight to continue toward any airport to which it has been dispatched or released if, in the opinion of the pilot in command or the dispatcher, the flight cannot be completed safely. Unless, in the opinion of the pilot in command, there is no safer procedure in that event, continuation toward that airport is an emergency as set forth in 121.557. All that's telling us is that, once again, the pilot in command and the dispatcher, they are the two people with operational control. They're the two people in charge of that flight. They are the two people that are in charge of the safety of that flight. If you, yeah?
Sorry. Would the PIC have to declare it as an emergency at that point?
Yeah, and we'll talk about that here in just 1 second. But
okay.
If you're heading to an airport and that airport is, if something happens there that it's might affect the safety of the operation, then, or if you determine that the flight cannot be completed safely, then you're not allowed to continue toward that airport if you deem it as being an unsafe operation to continue there, okay? The only way you can continue there is if you determine that there is no safer option than continuing. A perfect example is the Hawaii type flight, right? So now typically when you are dispatching a flight over the lower 48 contiguous states, you're going to have hundreds of airports that you can go to. So it's not going to really be a situation to where, like, oh, there was no other option. That's not really an excuse in the, lower 48. But if you're flying California to Hawaii and you're a little bit more than halfway there, and let's say a hurricane rolls in, affecting the entire island chain, okay, not just wherever you were going. Let's say it was going to Honolulu, and hurricane or a tropical storm. Obviously it's kind of a rare scenario because most of that stuff is well forecasted. But let's just say an unforecasted tropical storm or hurricane rolls in and is not only affecting Honolulu, but all of the other islands. So it's not like you could just, okay, well, we're just going to go to the big island, or we're going to go to Maui instead, or whatever. It's all of the islands are being affected. However, you're a little bit more than halfway, so you can't turn back because you don't have enough fuel to go back to California. Okay? So turning around is not an option. The only option in that case, and the safest in that case, would be continuing toward the hurricane bound islands and finding a safe place to land. So obviously you really have to reach to find a good example for this. But that's one of the only ones that kind of makes sense. Normally you're not going to see that, but if you do have to do that, then you are continuing as an emergency. You have to declare it as an emergency to continue on. And that's pretty much, it's pretty cut and dry, that rule. It's just basically saying in a normal condition, if there's something unsafe at the airport you're going to, then the regulation says you shouldn't go there and you're not supposed to go there and you need to find somewhere else to go, unless it's the only option and it's the safest option. And in that case, you need to declare an emergency and then continue on. So.
Thanks.
Let's see. If any instrument or item of equipment required under this chapter for the particular operation becomes inoperative en route, the pilot in command shall comply with the approved procedures. Okay, so we don't really care about that part too much. This next little part, 121.628. No person may take off an airplane with inoperable instruments or equipment installed unless the conditions are met in an approved minimum equipment list. And that is something we're going to talk about later on at length. The minimum equipment list, MEL items, is basically just a document that says there's certain things on an airplane that can be inoperative, and it can still fly safely with passengers on board. And you have to use this document to determine whether or not it abides by those rules. So otherwise, you can't take off in an airplane that has inoperable instruments unless those instruments are listed in the minimum equipment list and you abide by those operations. So you're going to learn a lot about that later. Don't worry about it too much for now. Operations in icing conditions. Does anybody need a quick break? My plan was to go, well, I was really only going to go like another 10 or 15 minutes. I don't think we'll get all the way through, but what we have left would be stuff that we can easily cover still, like on part of Monday, which has some extra time built into it. So I was going to go just a few more minutes and then wrap it up for tonight anyway, if everyone's cool with that. This is pretty much the last thing I was going to talk about tonight was icing conditions. So if any of you were kind of waiting around.
Yeah, let's power through.
Okay. So my plan was to end by 10:30, or not 10:30, 8:30 your time, 10:30 my time.
Please, let's not go to 10:30 Mountain.
Yeah. So So if any of you were waiting around for a break, that was kind of the idea, was just to end there. And then, so we'll just talk about icing, and then we'll be done for tonight. And then if you have the gumption to, read forward over the weekend and stuff and continue reading the ones boxed in red, more power to you. Okay, operations and icing conditions. No person may dispatch or release an aircraft, continue to operate an aircraft en route, or land an aircraft when, in the opinion of the pilot in command or aircraft dispatcher, icing conditions are expected or met that might adversely affect the safety of flight. No person may take off an aircraft when frost, ice, or snow is adhering to the wings, control surfaces, propellers, engine inlets, or other critical surfaces of the aircraft, or when the takeoff would not be in compliance with paragraph C of this section. Takeoffs with frost under the wings in the area of the fuel tanks may be authorized by the FAA. So let's just talk about what we've read so far. So basically just saying the one that we really care about the most is the paragraph A. No person may dispatch or release an aircraft or continue operating an aircraft en route or land when, in the opinion of the PIC or the dispatcher, icing conditions are expected or met that might adversely affect the safety of flight. So what that means to us is icing is one of the biggest adverse weather effects that you can have on an aircraft. And we talked a little bit about it earlier when Elizabeth was talking about that American Eagle crash, that it was an icing crash. There's been a couple of icing crashes that we're going to learn about later on in a few weeks. But just to kind of sum it up, icing is a very normal thing for an aircraft to encounter. Okay, the big thing that we care about, in fact, most aircraft, I would say 95% of the flights that you dispatch will encounter icing at some point in the flight. Okay, the only thing that we care about is how bad is that icing that they're going to encounter. Okay, because the aircraft that we dispatch, they have anti-icing capabilities, and the icing that they encounter will never adversely affect the safety of flight, because it's just going to be a light icing, but due to the capability of the aircraft, it can get rid of that icing. So the only time that we become concerned about icing is when we have weather reports of severe icing. Okay, and you'll see later on how to determine and distinguish what severe icing is and where it is and how we know that it's severe in nature. But anything less than severe, we don't care about. Okay, the only time we care about it outside of being in the severe level is if the aircraft has some sort of a mechanical problem which is disabling its anti-icing capabilities. Okay, but as long as the aircraft has normal anti-icing capability, then the only type of icing that we will ever be concerned about is severe icing. Okay, and it has its own category. And you're probably wondering, well, what constitutes severe icing? Well, we're not going to talk about it now because you're going to learn about it later, but you'll have a very good idea of why and what is severe icing later on. But typically with our aircraft, and as long as the anti-ice capabilities are functioning properly, icing, even, you've got moderate icing, light. I mean, you've got a lot of different categories of icing, but anything that's not severe in category will not adversely affect the safety of our flights. So if it is severe, though, then we cannot dispatch or release an aircraft into that area where severe icing is expected. Okay, that's all that this is telling us, is that you can't send an airplane into an area or fly through an area or continue flying through an area or land at an airport that is expected to have icing in the severe category. Okay. Paragraph B is just basically saying no person may take off an aircraft when frost, ice, or snow is adhering to the wings, control surfaces, propellers, or engine inlets. So that's basically what de-icing is. When you have a plane on the ground, and even if it has a little blanket of frost on the wings or something like that, you always have to get rid of that. You cannot take off if any sort of icing, even if it's like the smallest, tiniest bit, you cannot take off if it's on the wings. So a lot of times you might find that you find out you got to go de-ice, you take a look at the wing, you can barely see anything. Well, there might be a tiny, tiny, tiny layer of frost or something. That always has to be removed before you take off with anti or de-icing procedures. So that's all that's saying is that that's not something normally a dispatcher will ever worry about because he's not physically there at the airport, at the aircraft to determine whether or not there's frost, ice, or snow adhering to the wings. That's the pilot's jobs. It's their call. They're the ones that have to go look and then figure out if they need to go de-ice. And the only thing that you care about as a dispatcher is if you have an airport that all the aircraft are de-icing. Like Rex was saying earlier, he saw a guy that added some extra fuel because there was de-icing delays. Well, that's where that's pretty much the only situation that you're going to become involved in this scenario is if you see that Chicago has a bunch of all the planes are having to de-ice and they're taking delays because of that. Well, then you might add extra fuel because of de-ice delays. But outside of that, you're not going to care. It's paragraph A is the one that you care about. And then paragraph C is just telling us that each airline needs to come up with their own ground de-icing, anti-icing program in its manuals and teach it basically to their people. Once again, that's not going to be a dispatch responsibility. That's not going to be something you care about. That's going to be the people at the stations that have to learn how to de-ice their aircraft. They have to go through those programs and become certified under the de-icing, the ground de-icing programs for each individual airline and aircraft type, and follow the directions that the airline prescribes to their employees. And like I said, a dispatcher will never be somebody that's going to be de-icing. Any questions on that? Operations and icing conditions? Nothing. Everybody good then as far as the covered a decent amount, a lot of information to kind of digest. So if nobody has anything, then we'll just stop right there for tonight. The rest of it we can get through pretty quick on Monday. But yeah, any last comments, concerns, questions, anything?
I shot you a private question earlier, Adam. I didn't know if you saw it.
I may not have. Let's see. Oh yeah, there is. In fact, yeah.
Okay, cool.
In fact, yeah. We've actually a few of them have set that up. So yeah, just one thing that she was mentioning was just anybody who's not a SkyWest employee or has some sort of a SkyWest contact that wants to that's in a position where they can spend some time doing some dispatch job shadowing while the class is going on, even before the class is over, that wants that opportunity. Just let me know. I can set it up very, very, very easily anytime you'd like. So if anybody wants to do that, just let me know. Text me, email me. It's usually easiest on weekends to do that, as the flight schedule is usually not as busy and not as heavy like on Saturdays. Saturdays is a great day to go job shadow if any of you guys want to do that. It's also a little bit easier because the rest of the building is usually empty as well. So just let me know, though. I can set that up anytime. So anything else from anybody?
Good week.
Okay, good deal. Yeah, end of the first week then. So hopefully it met all your wildest dreams.
Good job, everyone.
Thanks.
Yeah, good job. And any questions or anything that needs addressing, feel free to email me or Garrett or text us, call us, whatever's easiest for you guys. But yeah, take a look at this, go back and study through these FARs, and yeah, we'll call it a night. And everybody have a good night and enjoy whatever you're going to do for the rest of the day and the rest of the weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great weekend.